Hello and a very warm welcome to a brand new edition of World Panorama with me, Frank Pereira. First up, a look at the headlines. Another tragedy strikes a Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 brought down by a land-to-air missile in eastern Ukraine. Obama says Russian separatists brought down the plane. Israel steps up offensive, presses ground troops into action in Gaza. Hamas warns of bitter end to conflict. A $100 billion BRICS Development Bank becomes a reality. Bank to be based in Shanghai with India as its first president. Calls for UNSC reforms and a flurry of agreements, the other big takeaways from the BRICS summit. Heroes' reception for a German football team in Berlin. Nearly 4 lakh jubilant fans welcomed their triumphant national soccer team after winning the World Cup in Brazil. Well, our top focus this week, Malaysian Airlines MH17 crash. The blame game continues in Ukraine over the Malaysian plane crash that took place earlier this week. Both the Ukrainian government and rebels have denied downing the plane. With all 298 passengers on board believed to be dead, the tragedy has prompted shock and anger from several international leaders.
A day after the Malaysian flight MH17 was allegedly shot down over eastern Ukraine, rescue workers continue to search for bodies at the crash site. At least 100 bodies have been found so far, with little hope of finding any survivors of the 298 on board. Pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine have agreed to give international investigators access to the crash site. Rescue workers have also recovered the plane's black box from the debris, which could shed more light on the final moments inside the jet.
I'm just thinking that I feel like I've been given a second chance, and so hopefully that we'll get there safely and we'll see my family again.
The crash has stoked tensions between Kiev and Moscow as they blame each other for shooting down the plane with a missile. Ukraine called it an act of terrorism, blaming Russia for supplying rebels with advanced weapons.
We ask our international partners to call an emergency UN Security Council meeting and to make everything we can to stop this war.
Этой трагедии не произошло бы, если бы на этой земле был мир, и во всяком случае не были бы возобновлены боевые действия.
Condolences and concern poured in from across the globe. International leaders have called for a thorough and unbiased investigation into the incident.
Jetzt möglich eine unabhängige Untersuchung eingeleitet wird. Dazu ist ein Waffenstillstand notwendig. Und es ist dann natürlich wichtig, dass auch Verantwortliche zur Rechenschaft gezogen werden.
All governments, the Russian government, the Ukrainian government, all of them must do everything they can so that we get to the bottom of what happened in this absolutely dreadful loss of life.
The idea that Russia can somehow say that none of this has anything to do with them because it happened in Ukrainian airspace, frankly, does not stand up to any serious scrutiny.
There is a clear need, a full and transparent international investigation.
Malaysia has condemned the shooting down of MH17. Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak said that they were trying to figure out the cause of the crash, but he added that the crew members in the plane did not make a distress call.
At this stage, however, Malaysia is unable to verify the cause of this tragedy. But we must and we will find out precisely what happened to this flight.
The flight was on its way from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur. Public buildings in the Netherlands were flying flags at half-mast on Friday to mourn the deaths. The flight was carrying at least 173 Dutch nationals, 27 Australians and 44 Malaysians. It is the second disaster to have hit Malaysian Airlines this year.
And joining me on the show this week is the associate editor of The Hindu, Mr. Muralidhar Reddy. Muralidhar, thank you so much for joining us on the show. I mean, it was a tragedy indeed. Not the first time that something like this has happened with the Malaysian Airlines flight. The previous one, the MH372, was an utterly tragic incident. This one, too, extremely tragic. What are the kind of ramifications this incident is going to have?
See, there are two specific aspects to this. One is this particular, call it, I don't know, incident or accident, because there are all kinds of claims, counterclaims. It has obviously meant that there will be greater vigilance on the part of all airlines in flying over conflict zones. So it would mean that you have to be conscious of the fact that wherever there is conflict, so you have to factor in what is the nature of the conflict, how intense is it. So as far as the airline industry is concerned, that's one. But there is another dimension to it, that's the ongoing war in Ukraine. There, it's something that has been happening since the beginning of this year. And now, after this incident, it has taken another overtone, because both United States and Russia are trying to, use it for their own, call it propaganda, or to prove their point. So far, US has come out with a tentative conclusion that this has been shot down by rebels. This is being disputed by Russia. So that's where the crux of the problem lies. And it will certainly have serious repercussions in the tension that's already there between US and Russia.
Certainly, of course, the tensions are going to rise, and we've already seen several leaders from the West have gone out and said that, it is the separatists, the Russian separatists who are in Ukraine who have actually shot down this plane. Obama has gone on record to say that. The Australian Prime Minister, she too has gone on record to say that. I mean, where do we see this particular issue headed in the near future? I mean, what's going to happen now? Because the Russians are not going to take this lying down.
Russians are obviously not going to take it lying down, because it's linked to the larger issue of the ongoing conflict between United States and Russia on this whole issue of Ukraine. It got triggered when they wanted to align themselves with European Union. There were dominant sections in certain parts of Ukraine who are opposed to it. We saw what happened in Crimea. They decided to declare unilateral independence, and then they aligned themselves with Russia. So the larger picture is going to continue while the disaster, of course, it has already happened, and the probe, like, for instance, people have been asking for a transparent and independent international probe.
Is that going to happen? I mean, the separatists have already said that they're not going to allow anyone close to the crash site. And then after that, they've said, okay, maybe we'll cordon off the area. I mean, there's so much of ambiguity about the whole situation there.
No, that's one. And secondly, what constitutes an independent international inquiry?
That's also important.
So,
yes.
you see, in each conflict, this has been disputed by the stakeholders. Will it be investigated by UN? And if that is the case, will the Security Council allow such a thing to happen? Because you have Russia as a veto power there. So what constitutes? I think this is nothing more than rhetoric, because I don't see any kind of independent investigation taking place. Even if it happens, the outcome of that investigation is bound to be disputed.
Would this situation have been handled differently or looked at differently if the country in question was not Russia, or maybe, say, for instance, even an Israel? Would this situation have been looked at differently?
No, I don't think it would have been. You mean to say from the perspective of US and West?
Yes, US and West.
Obviously, they would have looked at it in an entirely different perspective. We saw what's going on in Gaza. I mean, it continues to be there, but the West or the US is not making the same kind of noise that they are making about this particular instance. So they're bound to look at it through their own tinted glasses, where their interests lie. So here, the idea of US is to somehow isolate Russia from their association or closeness to the East European or former Soviet republics. That's the big game, and this has been going on since, as I said, last 6 months. So obviously, Russia is going to fight to its best. It's not going to give up so easily.
Indeed, Russia and only the Russians probably can take on someone like the US and still, stand tall in a situation like this. Barack Obama, time and again in the recent past, has kept going on and talking about how the US is going to ensure that the sanctions are much tougher. There are going to be much stricter sanctions against Russia. Do you see that happening now that this incident has happened anytime soon?
Well, the sanctions began sometime in March. They've already come in 2 installments. Obviously, there will be more sanctions, but let's also not forget that the companies, whether it's in the West or in US, also have their stakes. Beyond a point, if you impose sanctions, they're going to impact these very companies that are looking for markets in Russia or the countries which are aligned with Russia. So they will be balancing that factor as well. Because if I'm not mistaken, when the first lot of sanctions came, there was some degree of resistance from the US companies.
Yes.
So I'm sure the same dynamics holds good in this case as well, because one is talking about a big country like Russia. It's not some small country where you can impose sanctions and you do not feel the repercussions of it, or you do not feel the heat of it.
Indeed, of course. Now, what has happened is, after this tragic incident, the airlines have decided not to take that route anymore. They're all bypassing or going around eastern Ukraine and not ensuring that they're going over the conflict zone as such. Should this have been done beforehand itself?
Well, as I said, like today, there's so many conflict zones. Some are of low intensity, some are of medium intensity, some are of high intensity. So each time you have to take a call depending on how, this kind of a thing has never happened over this particular sector. So obviously nobody had imagined that such a thing was possible. I was reading a report in the Pakistani media saying that they had suspended flying over this zone almost 3 months ago. Well, some countries had taken that decision, but the West or US, even in their reading, I don't think anybody had imagined that such an incident will take place.
But should they have seen it coming? Because the separatists had already shot down a couple of planes in the area just in that week itself. I mean, this week itself, 3 planes have already gone down. But they should have seen that coming. I mean, because this is something that was happening, and they could have done something about it. It was avoidable, at least.
Maybe in hindsight, maybe it was avoidable. But the fact is, every airline will also take into account what would be the economic costs involved. See, if you deviate from that route, how much more is it going to cost you? And how are you going to make up that money? As it is, aviation industry is under stress. So, see, when it comes to the hard economic realities, they also prevail when making even plausible and possible scenarios.
There are several theories doing the rounds. One of the theory was that the Ukrainians were aiming at Vladimir Putin's plane that was in that particular area at that point in time. And several such theories, of course, are doing the rounds at the moment. But the most concrete of those theories is that the separatists, the Russian separatists there in Ukraine, are the ones who brought down this particular plane. Now, if that is proven to be the fact, what do you see happening?
Well, as we discussed earlier, see, how do you prove it? I mean, what constitutes an investigation team which is going to be accepted by all sides? I don't see such a possibility. So, as we discussed again, the West and the US have already made a determination that it has been brought down by rebels. So, that debate is anyway on. It's going to add to the conflict that's already there. So, I don't see this going anywhere in terms of making a determination as to who did it and what should follow.
So we mourn the deaths of the people that we've lost and just go on with this and ensure that something like this does not happen in the future, because nothing else is going to happen out of this.
No, it's very much possible that United States will step up its pressure. One, of course, through economic sanctions and by kind of mobilizing its own, the countries which are aligned with it, as well as other countries.
But is it going to have a larger impact on what's happening in eastern Ukraine on the whole?
Definitely it's going to have impact because now the legitimacy of government in Ukraine to get assistance from other parts of the world is greater. So, and Russia is bound to step up its assistance in such a scenario. So it's going to escalate, the conflict is going to escalate unless all the stakeholders get down and, look at what is possible.
Right, certainly. Ms. Muralidhar, Reddy, thank you so much for joining us with your thoughts and perspectives as far as this particular issue is concerned. It's time for a short break now, but on the other side, we'll bring you the latest on the situation in Gaza, where Israel has intensified its ground offensive. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Rajya Sabha Television. Well, Israeli troops and tanks are engaged in a fierce battle in Gaza after the launch of a military ground operation by Israel. Hamas says its Qassam brigades are battle-ready to engage the Israeli forces, with many people killed and thousands injured. Observers say that this war may only be the beginning in Gaza.
אנחנו נצא למתקפה, היא תהיה מתקפה משולבת, יבשתית ואווירית, בתאום קרוב עם הפעלת כל העוצמה, הן בנתיבי ההתקדמות, הן במרחבים שלהם אנחנו הולכים, תפיסת השליטה האמיתית על המרחב.
After 10 days of bombardments from air and sea, Israel upped its offensive on Friday by launching a ground military operation in Gaza. Thousands of troops moved in on Thursday night itself, backed by tanks and artillery fire. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel was prepared to significantly widen its ground offensive.
מאחר שאין אפשרות לטפל רק מן האוויר במנהרות, חיילינו עושים זאת גם מן הקרקע. גם כאן אין ערבות ל-100% הצלחה, אבל אנחנו עושים הכל כדי להשיג את המרב. לצערנו כבר נפל חייל.
Shortly after the launch of the ground operation, Hamas warned Israel of dreadful consequences. In addition to the ground fighting, Israel launched airstrikes on over 100 targets overnight. An Israeli soldier was killed in the north of Gaza. The Palestinian death toll has so far climbed to more than 250. While close ally US urged Israel to restrict itself to a precise operation, Germany put its weight behind Israel, saying that Hamas had new weapons.
Ich glaube, man muss an dieser Stelle ganz klar sagen, Israel hat ein Recht auf Selbstverteidigung. Das muss natürlich immer angemessen durchgeführt werden, aber es gibt eine völlig neue Qualität der Bewaffnung der Hamas. Die israelischen Städte wie Jerusalem und Tel Aviv sind.
The renewed fighting comes a day after both Israel and Hamas stopped bombardment for 5 hours on Thursday to allow people in Gaza to restock food and cash. The United Nations accused Israel of ignoring calls for restraint. In a statement, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said, and I quote him now, "I regret that despite my repeated urgings and those of many regional and world leaders together, an already dangerous conflict has now escalated even further." Many other nations also pressed both parties to reach ceasefire.
And once again call for an immediate ceasefire to be observed by the United Nations, the ending of the cycle of violence, and the distributions of humanitarian assistance.
What we really want to see now is an enduring ceasefire that will allow the bloodshed on both sides to stop and the underlying causes of this problem to be resolved through negotiation.
Meanwhile, more and more Israeli reserve forces are gathering near the fighters. This is the third time in 6 years that Israel is sending ground troops into Gaza. No time frame has been announced for the new operation.
And on the first day of the BRICS summit in Fortaleza, Brazil, leaders of emerging market nations launched a $100 billion development bank and a currency reserve pool. India lost the bid for setting up the bank's headquarters, though the first bank president will be from India. The bank's headquarters will be set up in Shanghai. Here's more.
Spelling out new ways and means for sustainable development and financial inclusion, leaders from Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa signed the agreement for the creation of BRICS Development Bank, a concrete step towards reshaping the Western-dominated international financial system. Leaders were all in smiles as they joined hands in a team huddle in a sign of unity.
O novo Banco de Desenvolvimento dos BRICS deve ter capital inicial autorizado de 100 bilhões. Capital subscrito inicial de 50 bilhões.
They will also set up a $100 billion currency reserve pool to help countries anticipate short-term liquidity pressures. The BRICS Development Bank, aimed at funding infrastructure projects in developing nations, will be based in Shanghai. India will preside over its operations for the first 5 years, followed by Brazil and Russia.
Direção do Board de Diretores será do Brasil. O primeiro presidente do banco será da Índia e a sede do banco será localizada em Xangai.
A new development bank at the Delhi summit 2 years ago has been translated into a reality. It will benefit BRICS nations, but will also support other developing nations.
在各方共同的努力下，我们今天就建立开发银行达成共识。这是金砖国家合作进程中具有重要和深远意义的成果。
Addressing the summit, Prime Minister Narendra Modi also pitched for zero tolerance against terrorism. Meanwhile, on the sidelines of the summit, a group of Tibetan NGO, the International Tibet Support Network in Dharamshala, prompted Narendra Modi and other BRICS leaders to discuss the Tibetan issue with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Earlier on Tuesday, Modi had met Xi Jinping and held discussions on various issues. The new bank reflects the growing influence of the BRICS, which accounts for half the world's population and about 1/5 of the global economic output. Significantly, the bank will begin with a subscribed capital of $50 billion divided equally between its 5 founders, with an initial total of $10 billion in cash put over 7 years and $40 billion in guarantees. It is scheduled to start lending in 2016 and will be open to membership by other countries.
Much else has been unfolding around the world. Here's a quick wrap of the other international news of the week.
America's top diplomat and its defense chief will visit India in coming weeks. Secretary of State John Kerry will represent the United States in an annual session of strategic dialogue with India scheduled for 31st of July. He will be followed by Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel in early August. They will be the most senior US officials to visit India for talks with the new government. They'll be looking to revitalize a relationship the United States sees as a crucial counterbalance in Asia to an increasingly assertive China. The US and EU have bolstered sanctions against Russia over its alleged support for separatists fighting in Ukraine. The US has targeted major Russian banks, defense firms and energy companies. The EU said it would announce details of its sanctions by the end of July, but added that its investment banks would no longer fund Russian projects. Russian President Vladimir Putin has said sanctions would take US-Russia relations to a dead end. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has been sworn in for a new 7-year term after an election victory. The ceremony was held at the presidential palace in the Syrian capital, Damascus. The presidential election, dismissed as a sham by Assad's opponents, was held last month in areas of central and northern Syria that remain under state control. Pakistan's military says its jets killed 35 suspected militants as part of an anti-Taliban offensive, hours after US drones killed up to 20 people. The Pakistani jets carried out attacks in the Shawal Valley. The jets targeted members of the Pakistan Taliban and included Uzbeks, Chechens and Arab fighters who had fled to the remote Shawal region after the military's offensive launched last month. A nuclear plant in southern Japan cleared an initial safety hurdle which could see it become the first nuclear facility to restart under stricter safety guidelines after the Fukushima disaster. The new safety standards involve safeguards against natural disasters like earthquakes and tsunamis and severe nuclear accidents. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is pushing to restart the country's 48 nuclear reactors as a prolonged shutdown forces the nation to rely on expensive fossil fuel imports.
Let's shift focus now and bring you up to date with all the sporting action from around the world in our sports wrap.
Bayern Munich midfielder Toni Kroos has joined Real Madrid for an undisclosed fee on a 6-year deal. 24-year-old Kroos was a key player for Germany as they beat Argentina 1-0 to win the World Cup and scored 2 goals during the competition in Brazil. He was presented to the Real Madrid fans at Bernabeu on Thursday afternoon after undergoing a medical checkup. Kroos joined Bayern from Hansa Rostock as a 16-year-old and made 173 Bundesliga appearances. Arsenal's Mesut Ozil has declared that he is donating his World Cup winnings to good causes in Brazil and would pay for the surgery of 23 children in the South American country. Ozil, who helped Germany win a 4th world crown in Brazil, had paid for the surgery of 11 sick children in the host country ahead of the tournament. Now Ozil has revealed on his Facebook page that he would raise that number to 23 to mark the number of players in the German squad. Real Madrid forward Cristiano Ronaldo has reportedly been accused of loving himself too much, and his unbalanced attitude has been said to be at the root of Portugal's 2014 World Cup failure. The attack on Ronaldo came in a column penned by former Croatian footballer Zvonimir Boban. Boban wrote in his column that Ronaldo is an amazing player and he showed that again in Brazil, even if he missed a number of chances. But his biggest flaw is the way he looks at himself and the team. Boban suggested that the worrying signs for Portugal came when Ronaldo scored in the Champions League final for Real Madrid in May, removing his shirt for a photo opportunity. England have fallen to 20th in the latest FIFA World Rankings, their lowest position since May 1996. The drop of 10 places following a poor World Cup means they are behind Bosnia-Herzegovina, Costa Rica and the USA. World Cup champions Germany are the #1 team in the world for the first time in 2 decades. Argentina are ranked 2nd, followed by Netherlands, Colombia and Belgium, all of whom performed well in the recently concluded FIFA World Cup. Manchester City coach Manuel Pellegrini has turned down the chance to manage Brazil. Reports from Pellegrini's native Chile claimed the Manchester City boss was asked about the prospect of succeeding Luis Felipe Solari. Solari quit on Monday in the wake of hosts and 5-time winners Brazil's humiliating 7-1 World Cup semi-final defeat to eventual winners Germany. The Brazilian Football Federation are understood to have reached out to Pellegrini, but were told he would honor his contract with City and was not interested in the role.
That's it on this edition of World Panorama, but we leave you with visuals of the jubilant German football team who came back home to Berlin to a hero's welcome.